recording this. We had a few asks for that, which is wonderful. And lots of beautiful, beautiful faces. 7:32, so we'll go ahead and get started so we can stay on track. And I'm just gonna do a little screen share here so we can welcome you all and get us set up here on what is going on. And in our reminder email today, we shared with you guys that we're going to be using something called Mentimeter. So we'll be teaching something new. If you haven't tried it, it's wonderful. It really allows us to keep this interactive. And my name is Gabby Spat. I am from the Blue Dove Foundation. And if you haven't heard of us, we are based in Atlanta, and we focus on mental health education, awareness, and outreach through a Jewish lens. So while there are lots of organizations that work in the mental health sphere, we get to do it tying it to our faith, our culture, and our religion. We have Jewish mental health values that we work with, and we really look at the Jewish lens to connect. And one of the most important things to us is the idea of partnerships. And tonight, we are so glad to be doing this program with the Jewish Grandparents Network. And so to set up tonight, you've already seen the information about our speakers, Betsy and Lee, who are fabulous and wonderful and immediate best friends as they met each other over this program. And to make it interactive, we are going to be using something called Menti. And in the reminder email, we shared a little link and a little video. And on your screen, you'll see when the time comes. On the top of the screen, it says go to Menti, MENTI.com. And you can do this on your smartphone. You can do it on a web browser if you can. And you'll be asked for a code. And the code you'll enter is on the top of the screen, 4360618. And the idea is that we have some interactive questions to share with you guys. Throughout the entire program, you'll also be able to use the chat. If you have any questions you'd like to ask the speakers, David and I will be bringing them together, and we'll be able to ask the speakers those questions. And we invite you all to join us at the end of the program, where we'll be able to go into breakout rooms and have some more intimate conversation with participants. So with that, I'm just, again, so grateful to everybody that's here. You could be doing anything else on a Tuesday night in September, but you've chosen to spend your time here. And I will say, I love grandparents. I adore mine. I'm lucky enough to still have my grandpa at 102 and a half. And so this is a really, really special partnership for me. David, I'm going to hand it over to you to share a little bit about the Jewish Grandparents Network.
Hi, good evening, everybody. I'm David Rayfield. I'm the co-founder and executive director of the Jewish Grandparents Network. We're a 3-year-old organization, and we're the only national organization that supports grandparents as they embrace both traditional and radical new roles in their family. We recognize that perhaps even especially now during the COVID pandemic, that grandparents play essential roles in the intergenerational family and as transmitters of Jewish values, customs, and traditions. Our mission statement is empowering grandparents and advancing Jewish life. And the person who does that just about anybody better than anybody else is my co-founder and the president of the Jewish Grandparents Network, Lee M. Hendler.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, David. I really appreciate it. And I am now going to share with Betsy the opportunity to introduce ourselves to you. I hope you all had a chance to look at our bios. That's not how we want to share our first interaction with you all tonight, because we assume you're a bunch of really smart people. You read those to the degree that they interested you. You read them. What we want to share with you you and interact with you around is our story as grandmothers, as grandparents. And so what I wanted to ask Betsy to share with you is when we prepared for this session, Betsy shared with Gabby and with me that she was just about to spend 3 weeks living with one daughter while she prepared to spend 6 hours a day with the other daughter to help with that daughter's young children. And I said to turn to Betsy in this conversation. I said, so Betsy, is that normal for you? Betsy, is that normal? Betsy?
Yeah, I was muted.
Yep, got it.
Not normal for me, although I don't think since my oldest granddaughter was born, she is now 7 and a bit, I don't think I have gone more than a couple of weeks without seeing them. They live about 4.5, 5 hours from us, but I clearly need cuddle fixes, Eliana fixes. And I come down, I live in Connecticut, I come down to Maryland pretty regularly. They come up to Connecticut pretty regularly. We had been actually traveling right before the pandemic hit, got home without really much knowledge that the world had already gone into chaos. In South America, nobody was really talking about it. We went about a month before I needed to come and get skin. So this is actually our second trip down to be with the kids. Right now, I'm spending my nights with one daughter and my days with the other daughter in kindergarten, sitting next to my granddaughter as she learns about same and different and how to count on your fingers and how to trace letters. Because this is a blessing for me, and it is my job in many ways, I think, to support my own children in both their work and their parenting. How about you, Lee?
So my story is that I am the grandmother Gromsy to 6, and four of my grandchildren live here in Baltimore with their parents, and 2 live in Boston. And my pandemic story is that of the youngest of those 6 have been in very, very close proximity to me. I've been run over this past summer something called Gromsy Camp, which was originally intended to be for all 4 of those grandchildren. That did not work out so well because they ranged in age from 3 to 10 years old, and the mix of those children developmentally and socially it turned basically into a swim club, which was exhausting for all of us and fun in some ways, but not the experience that we thought it was going to be. And so eventually the 2 older kids dropped out of that, and it became a very intensive experience for the younger 2. That has morphed into Gromsy School for the 2 younger ones, who are probably not going to school this year, at least for the foreseeable future. And it has become a very intensive experience for me, for my daughter, for these 2 youngest children. And as Betsy and I were discussing, learning all over again what it is to be a preschool educator, deeply involved in these children's experiences while they are both flirting with online education, which my daughter and I are learning very quickly, does not work all that well with very young children, has been challenging. And mostly it has been about learning all over again how to play at a deeply improvisational level, day in and day out. And it has been both a joy and a source of such body bending and mind-rending exhaustion that it has stunned me. I am I'm a troll, I'm a witch, I'm a wizard, I am a magician, and mostly I'm just plain old Grums. That is their, you know, their playmate day in and day out.
So I think, Gabby, we were going to do our first mentee now, right?
Yes, we are.
Okay. So what we'd like to do is to spend a couple minutes thinking about what we've been surprised by in COVID. I will tell you that one of the things that I have actually been surprised by is the kindness of strangers. The number of people who speak to me and ask and simply say hello when I walk by them. What you do with Menti is you go to the menti.com, use this code, type in a word. You probably can type in a couple of words, and what Menti does is it populates what you're now seeing on the screen, and the things that we get more, that there are more responses to, get larger. So that if you write down, if 20 of you write down, I'm sadness will become a bigger word. And if one of you writes down isolation is a smaller word. So if you would, take a minute and go to Menti and use that code and just tell us in a word or two what has surprised you the most. I can already see that isolation is getting bigger. And that other things are getting smaller, which has to do with the things that we had already pre-populated this with. Don't you wish you had invested in Zoom? So I'm struck by.
Yes. So what strikes you most about it, Betsy?
Well, the thing that strikes me the most about it right now is what's not up there. That I'm not seeing illness up there, and I'm not seeing death up there, and which are, you know, obviously with almost 190,000 Americans gone. Those are big, those could be very big up there. I'm not, and so I'm kind of struck that by both the positive and the negative things that are here, not that they're not things like grace and family connection and grandkids having time for me. But it makes me wonder if there are parts of our communities that have really not been touched by Krisha. What you do is you go to Menti, look on the screen, it says up at the top what to do. Go to menti.com. I know I was speaking with a rabbi who I taught when she was in rabbinical school, and she said that in the first 3 months of COVID, that her particular community had 32 deaths, a congregation of 500 families. That's just a huge number of deaths, and frankly, a huge percentage of deaths. Because I'm in the New York City area and Westchester, and in the Westchester area, which is where one of the first significant hotspots was, the rabbis that I have been working with since the beginning of the lockdown have been doing an awful lot of funerals with families at a distance. One of the rabbis early on called me in tears after having done vidui with over the phone, and said she had never done anything quite so out of body in her life. They are not surprised. Susan and Bob, you are correct. They are not surprises. they're not surprises.
So what might be a surprise is the loss of the ability to manage the death and disease and illness in the way that we are accustomed to.
Yes.
And that I don't think we can capture quite in a Menti one-word response.
Right.
And
And
that I think is what people were kind of reeling from, is how do you know, David, for instance, lost, I'm speaking for him, but you know, all of us know somebody who has lost a family member. How do you do Shiva in the midst of a pandemic? And those are very real and powerful things.
Right. And as we think about ourselves as grandparents, how do our grandchildren and our children both protect us and express their fears for us? Because most of us who are grandparents are over that magic 60 years old, which makes us higher risk. So
if we are moving on, let's talk a little bit more in depth about trauma, Betsy. And can you help us to have a shared understanding as we move forward about what trauma is and how we might experience it?
Absolutely. So I'm going to share a screen with you. I'm not a big fan of doing this, but I don't know how to avoid it. What I'm giving you here is a psychological definition of trauma. I point this out to you because as a psychologist, I'm quite aware that the psychiatric definition of trauma is different. And so it's kind of striking that the psychiatric definition of trauma requires some physical harm or overt physical threat, which psychological definition does not require. So we're going to use the psychological one because I'm a psychologist and it's what I'm more comfortable with. There are 5 components to this, and I want us to look at all 5. Trauma is the response to a deeply distressing or disturbing event that overwhelms an individual's ability to cope, causes feelings of helplessness, diminishes their sense of self and their ability to feel the full range of emotions and experiences. Now, when we're talking about trauma, we're talking about at least 3 generations of trauma. We're talking about trauma in grandparents, trauma in parents, and trauma in children. So I want to break this down into the kind of 5 components that are in this definition because I think they're all important. First of all, trauma is a response to a real event. It's not an imagined event. It's not a bad dream. A friend of mine told me this story recently that his wife woke him up in the middle of the night and said to him, "I had a terrible dream about you and you need to apologize to me." That's not trauma, because that's not real. This is real. And we find ourselves in a reality which is both shared and separate. So that my experience of trauma is different than Lee's, is different than Gabby's, it's different than David's, it's different than all of yours. So we may all be responding to a universal experience, but my own personal experience is layered on top of the universal experience. It overwhelms our ability to cope. For most of us, our coping skills are things that we have always done and that we continue to do whether they work or they don't work. So for example, I confess that one of my favorite coping skills is sugar. And I will also confess that it doesn't usually work. That when I'm overwhelmed, turning to sugar doesn't actually make me feel better, except in the very brief temporary moment. But what we do when we are in trauma, we go back to those coping skills over and over and over again, expecting that they will, at some point, they will kick in and be useful. Trauma causes feelings of helplessness. I don't think there's anything more universal in the experience of COVID than this feeling of helplessness, that there is nothing I actually can do that makes a significant difference. Now, there are lots of things I can do that make a small difference. Whether it's leaving a note for the postal carrier saying, I really appreciate the work you're doing, or thanking the person in the grocery store, or making a donation or running a program like this. Those are all things which diminish our feelings of helplessness, but they never make them go away. Diminishes our sense of self. So my sense of self is the ideas that I have about myself that I carry with me through my lifetime. They are defining words that I use to describe myself. So they range from, I don't like green beans. That's actually part of how I define myself. More likely, I don't like chocolate, which is even more of how I define myself, to I like to read. That's a part of my sense of self. And one of the things that happens in trauma is that some of those things that are the way I think of myself actually change. So for example, many of us could not read at the beginning of this, or could not read the same kind of quality or quantity that we had normally. So my sense of myself as a reader has actually diminished and changed. And finally, trauma diminishes our ability to feel our emotions and experiences. It may tamp down on our joy. It may amp up on our rage. It may amp up on our sense of disconnect. My normal sense of myself and how I emotionally experience the world and intellectually experience the world are changed by trauma. So we are all in, I'm going to stop screen sharing now. We are all in trauma to one degree or another. One of the things that is particularly interesting from a psychological point of view is this layering of individual and communal trauma, because we presume that if I am in trauma and you are in trauma, we are experiencing the same thing. It is not true. And the analogy that works the best for me is that you may be cold and I may be hot. The temperature hasn't changed. That actually my personal experience of what is happening now, even though the objective, what is happening now is the same for all of us. My personal experience is my personal experience and probably much more fluid than the objective experience that we're all having. So if we think about those five parts and we think about them in terms of how they look.
How do they manifest?
Thank you, Lee. So there are a couple of ways that we're going to see them immediately in manifestation. First of all, for almost all of us, there's sleep disruption. The reason that there's sleep disruption is has to do with the way your brain works, that in fact, our brains are on high alert because we're afraid. And when your brain is on high alert, it doesn't make any sense for you to be able to sleep deeply. So there's been sleep disruption for most of us. One of the ways we see that is I'm the queen of an hour and a half in the middle of the night awake.
Can we just have a show of hands really briefly if that's happened for people? Just curious, okay?
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be an hour and a half. But
just at some time in the middle of the night, you just kind of wake up and that hasn't happened to you before.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
We also are dreaming differently. That has to do with the fact that we're not sleeping as deeply. And so though we are not dreaming more, we are more likely to remember our dreams. And we are also more likely to have dreams that are distressing dreams, which are more likely to wake us up. So sleep disruption is pretty common, and it's common across the board. Small children are experiencing this as well as adults, which I think is interesting in and of itself. There is also some significant what we call in the business hyper alertness, that we are slightly on edge all the time. For some of us, that has manifested in lots more fighting. For some of us, it is manifest in lots more sadness. But we're having these more extreme emotions. And the other piece of this is, of course, that for most of us who live with other people, we have never spent this much time with those people in our entire lives. Even those of us who are in happy, extant long-term marriages, I've never spent this much time with my husband, ever. And I like my husband, but he gets in my way sometimes. I mean, in fact, this forced intimacy is actually really difficult for us because we're used to having separateness and space. We don't really have that. For those of us who live alone, the isolation is extraordinary. And we know that isolation is actually really bad for people psychologically. Not that separateness is bad for us, because lots of us need a lot of private time. But that the sense of isolation, which is kind of, I get to define if I feel isolated, not you. Again, it's idiosyncratic. Isolation is not good for people. And the third thing that we're seeing really commonly is heightened anxiety. There is some data that's coming out now that is indicating that there are more people who are having suicidal thoughts. There are more people who are more frightened, that there are more people who are in more pain. At the beginning, we weren't seeing that very much. And I was really struck by it at the beginning because I couldn't understand why it wasn't happening. It's happening now. And I'm also really concerned about how that anxiety and psychological pain is going to manifest when we do get some space from COVID and we begin to re-enter the world. In children, we're going to see these differently. In children, so human beings across the board respond to trauma by regressing. Nobody gets a pass on that one. And so in children, we're used to thinking of regression in terms of things like toilet training and stuff and other kinds of slipping back in skills. We will see that. We also will see an increase in clinginess because they're feeling insecure. And so they're actually, they get to the point where you want to shake your leg and have them fall off. And their parents absolutely want that. And we also see just an increase in emotionality writ large. And so that may be more whining, it may be more rage, it may be more broken windows, it may be more coloring on the walls. There's lots of ways in which kids demonstrate that they're kind of heightened emotion, which is also true of us. We just tend not to color on the walls or slip up in toilet training, but instead we pick fights. Or cry a lot. Those are kind of the same in many ways. So, Lee, I think you're supposed to ask me how grandchildren.
I am. Well, you need to take a breath, everybody. What's really interesting is as I'm listening to you and I'm sort of cataloging all of this and did when we first spoke is that I'm going check, 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 as I'm listening to all of this in terms of my ongoing interactions, particularly with these younger grandchildren with whom I'm spending so much time and thinking about, well, how could I be helpful in my interactions with them? Both the ones that I'm interacting with regularly in such an intensive way, and the ones that I'm interacting with less regularly and interacting with differently. So I have two grandchildren whom I interact with. I have one grandchild who calls me on FaceTime regularly. She's 10 years old and she just loves to FaceTime with me. But it's a very different kind of interaction. And I'm thinking, what's going on with this child who longs to connect with me in this way? What is she looking for that I can provide for her? And I know this child is feeling things. There is so much going on in her life. So what is it that I can be doing for them that is unique for that I can do with them based on the special relationship that grandparents have with their grandchildren?
Great question. So with a 10-year-old, I think the biggest answer is be available and be responsive. A 10-year-old is actually trying to figure out how much control she has over her life, how much power she has in her life. And so every time she reaches out to you, or many of the times that she reaches out to you, what she's doing is she's actually taking charge. Remember, in our definition of trauma, one of the things was those feelings of helplessness. And to the extent to which we can empower kids in small ways, by responding to what they want and they're talking about. That's really useful to them, because what that does is it gives them a sense of power, and power is part of the way I manage myself, is by seeing what I have, what I'm in charge of. It's actually really useful for us to think about to think about how we give choices to children that are reasonable choices, as opposed to all the choices. Kids don't need all the choices. They need choices that are reasonable. They need red apple or green apple choices, not what would you like to eat. That's not true with the 10-year-old. The 10-year-old is in charge of what she wants to eat largely. But I think that we have to remember in this magic role of grandparent that we are not their parents. I actually think that one of the most frustrating parts about having adult children, writ large, is that I don't have that my power is terribly limited. I can't make them do what I want them to do. I can't make them make the choices I would make. And I'm done parenting. I can parent my children, but I can't parent their children. And so I think that one of the things that a grandparent does, and does beautifully, is to create a resource, to be a resource, to be playful, to be engaged, to be silly, because I don't have to do the vast majority of the discipline. Now, in Lee's situation, where she is with them every day, there is no question she is doing discipline. In my situation, where I am now with them every day, there's no question I am doing discipline. However, that's not the primary function of a grandparent. It is, in many ways, the primary function of a parent, to teach children how to navigate the world. Grandparents do not have to do that. Grandparents get to give children experiences. And I actually think that that's one of the great blessings of being a grandparent, is the opportunity to give experiences, to give opportunities, to be the person who can be truly silly. My granddaughters and my daughter and I went for a walk the other day, and one of my daughter said to her children, hold on to Nana's hand, because if you don't, she'll wander off. And so we played this game where literally they would drop my hand and I would turn and walk in a completely different direction. That's not parenting. Though what I'm doing is I'm absolutely teaching them things about wandering and joking and all sorts of things like that. And I'm being playful, but I'm not the disciplinarian. And I know that. I think that's really important for us to remember. I think the other thing that we do that is unique to the grandparent role is that we are storytellers.
Correct.
My grandchildren love hearing stories about their mother, their aunt, and their uncle, and what happened when they were growing up. And those stories are stories which I use intentionally to achieve a particular goal. I tell stories when I think the story is meaningful and is giving them information about who they can become. So I want you to think about your storyteller, your role as storyteller. And finally, I think that that we can teach them all sorts of forms of emotional literacy. So one of the things that I've done with all three of my granddaughters, and the youngest one is 2, is I sing songs to them that they know, and then ask them what I'm feeling when I sing the song. Now, I'm not going to force you to listen to me sing the alphabet, because I'm a terrible singer. But if I sing them the ABCs, I can sing the ABCs with joy, or I can sing the ABCs with sadness. And I think that one of the things that I get to do with them is I get to say to them, sing them the same song with a very different affect, and have them then be able to articulate and label, what is Nana feeling? That actually is a way to give them emotional literacy that their parents do. I do better. And I think that's really important. I also, go ahead, Lee, sorry.
Betsy, I wanted to play off of the moment where you very playfully allowed your grandchildren to actually play the caretaker role for you, and to connect that to something beautiful that Jane Isay writes about in her book, which is that grandchildren also do something very important for us. They recognize us, they see us, they love us for who we are. There is something powerful and inherently healing in that, and validating. In this world, we're grandparents, where the senior members of society often become invisible as we age. And we are so important to our grandchildren. So even at this moment of trauma for all of us, for both the grandparent generation and the grandchild generation, there is something very powerful that grandchildren do for us. When we allow that space in our hearts, is when we allow them to reach out to us and take care of us and show how much they love us. It is really something incredibly powerful.
Erev Shabbat, I was at my granddaughter's house. My daughter, both, there's too many daughters in this dance. I was at my granddaughter's house, and we lit candles, and I blessed all my son-in-law, my daughter, and my 3 granddaughters. And my oldest granddaughter said to me, "Why do you get to bless me and I don't get to bless you?" And I said to her, "You can bless me." And she put her her lips on my head and mumbled something, and then said, "Nana, I love you. Good Shabbos." Okay, I'm done. This is the kind of comfort that we get from our grandchildren when we are open to it. And that was both that she loves me, but also that she was taking my modeling and making it her own. I could not have been happier. Look for moments where your grandchildren can do to you what you do to them. It's a gift to them as well as to you.
Yes.
I want to take a minute right now and ask you all, because there are 62 of you, and mostly it's been me talking. I want to take a minute and ask you all if you have questions thus far, things that we've talked about that you want to comment on, questions that you have about any of the content thus far. You will have time in breakout rooms if you want it at the end of our evening together. So any comments or questions? There is a chat box there. In reactions, I think you can raise your hand. No. Okay.
Well, can we spend a few moments talking about the trauma that parents in particular, you said 3 generations, obviously we know, but can you talk for just a moment in particular about the trauma that you believe that parents may be experiencing, and why it is so important for grandparents to understand and appreciate that and factor that into our functioning in this family system, in this dynamic family system?
So that's a great question, Lee. And David as well, there are so many aspects of pressure and stress that are directly happening to the parent generation. They have to work. They have to feed their families. They have to manage their children. They are with their children and their partners more than they've ever been. They're in pain. Their kids are in pain. Their partners are in pain. And the thing we have to watch out for, the thing we have to not do is give them instructions or suggestions. Every time I make a suggestion, and every time someone makes a suggestion to me, I know what they're saying is I'm not doing it well enough, whatever it is. What our kids need from us right now, more than anything else, is a combination of physical and financial support, Some of them need that more than others, and huge psychological support. You can always find something that you can tell your son or daughter that they are doing well. It doesn't matter what it is. They desperately need to hear it. They are working 24/7 and getting very little done and being criticized massively by other people for not doing things well enough. They have they get yelled at if they take their kids to the grocery store. They get yelled at if they go to the playground. The amount of competition between parents who are, in my home community, parents have a choice about hybrid or virtual learning for their children. The amount of psychological pressure between parents is astronomical. So if you choose to send your kid to hybrid schooling, which means they go to school a couple of days a week and they do virtual a couple of days a week, if you choose to send your kid to hybrid schooling, the people who are only doing virtual schooling are criticizing you, and vice versa. They have very little in the way of support systems. PTAs aren't meeting, moms groups aren't meeting. They are really isolated, and they are isolated with kids. Look, I have never spent this much time, as much time as my children are spending with their children. I've never spent that much time with my own kids. And even when you go on vacation, vacation has lots of structure. This has very little structure, and the lack of structure is actually really hard on both kids and adults. So what I think our kids need from us, some of them need financial help, some of them need physical help. All of them need to know that we think that they are doing a good job. Even when there are 8 things they're doing poorly and 2 things they're doing well, focus on the 2 things they're doing well. Because the 8 things they're doing poorly, they are doing the best they can do. And I think it's really important. Look, we have so much power as parents. As I was leaving my daughter's house today, I said to her, I'm about to go. Do you need me? And she said, I need you all the time. And I thought to myself, but now can I leave? They need us. And my words have more power than in COVID than they normally do. Our kids are also socially isolated, our adult children. They aren't with their friends. They're not with their buddies. They're not going out. They're not going to the movies. They're not going drinking. They're not doing any of the things that feel normal to them. They've had loss on loss on loss, just like we have, and they're managing small children. In terms of the long distance parenting, a 5-month-old is really hard to engage with, except if you can convince their mom or dad to put them in some kind of seat and you can sing to them. You can absolutely do that. I think that we are blessed by these forms of technology, which allow us to interact with our children at a much more present level. I spend a lot of time when I'm home in Connecticut in this position. Lee's getting a lot of FaceTime. Any kind of face-to-face interaction is better than not. I also would suggest to you, with a 4-year-old granddaughter, I would send her drawings in the mail. There is nothing as exciting as getting a letter in the mail. And a letter is better than a present, because a present is about the present and a letter is about the relationship. Does that make sense? That if I send you a book, I'm sending you a book. The book is the most important part. If I send you a letter, I and you are the most important part.
I used to draw with my grandchildren on FaceTime. I would draw anything that they wanted me to draw, and we would have these wild sort of, and I have whole notebooks of what they would have me draw for them as we were talking. And these were adventures that we would have together. And right. I still have a number of them. So
Lee clearly has an amazing imagination, and I don't think everybody should expect themselves to have that kind of.
They were not necessarily good drawings. No. These were stick drawings. It doesn't matter.
But I think that all of us can do some kind of exchange with them, and I cannot tell you make the statements more strongly that letters matter. Kids love letters.
You can also do scavenger hunts.
Absolutely.
Scavenger hunts with your grandchildren while you are online with them,
Right.
in the same room. I'm,
Right.
asking them to look for objects that are in the room with them,
Right.
so that you're engaged right then, right there with them.
I also have read to my granddaughters over Zoom.
Sure.
There's lots of things you can do using this medium, but it requires that you treat your adult children with respect, and that you recognize that there are times they can't do this because they are in chaos land. That's also something that's really important for you to understand, that the gatekeepers to your grandchildren are their parents, and that you really have to treat them with an enormous amount of honor and kavod. I'm just reading to see.
I'm mindful of our time.
Okay.
We only have 12 minutes left of our time together, and wondering whether we want to take the temperature of the group on the second Menti question that we had, or whether we wanted to move on to the question of the unique challenges of navigating the pandemic in terms of the complexity of this kind of trauma, with that really interesting quote, and why.
Let's go to the quote.
Okay.
Is that okay, Gabby? Is that okay, David?
Gabby, can you put that up for us, please? So we usually think about trauma, as Betsy had originally said, in terms of a singular event, and COVID is this unfolding event. I think is one of the people, somebody mentioned that he had experienced this in another country, and it was very similar. It's this unfolding event with multiple factors and layers, and it's taking place for us in the midst of a highly volatile political environment. So let's look at this quote from a trauma specialist. In the beginning of the pandemic, people said, we're all in the same boat. Let me remove myself because I can't. We're all in the same boat. We're not. Rather, we've been in the same storm, and some are weathering it in the shattering catastrophe boat, while others are in the mild inconvenience boat. But even if you haven't experienced personal trauma, the absence of routine and predictability has been profoundly taxing. Humans are meant to be in physical proximity, to touch, to smell. So I think the importance of connection to your family, neighborhood, culture is the most powerful lesson we can learn now. The best predictor of mental health, of how you function in the present, isn't really your history of trauma. It's your history of connection.
So I love this quote. I want to make one comment on it. That I think is important for us to, one thing about this that I disagree with, which is that trauma actually begets trauma. And so that if what happens with new trauma is that it pulls up old trauma. And so this experience is pulling up old trauma for all of us. Any trauma that you've had in your lifetime is being exacerbated and remembered in some sense by this new trauma. However, I do think that the lack of connectedness is part of what is making this so painful. It's not just the lack of connectedness with people we love, it's actually the lack of connectedness with people writ large. One of the things that my HUC students talked about very early in the pandemic was the weirdness of not being able to walk out of a classroom and complain to each other and say meaningless things to each other. That in fact, one of the things that human beings do to maintain connection is we make meaningless statements. I hated that room was so cold, that student is a jerk. We just comment, we narrate our lives. And that's actually one of the things that we teach parents to do all the time with small children, is to narrate your life. to say, oh, I'm wearing a blue shirt today and there's a red building and over on the side, and that we narrate our lives. We don't have anybody to narrate our lives to in the same way. And that's a real loss, that sense of connectedness that comes from that mutual narration.
Is that one of the reasons why it's so taxing for people who are living in such close proximity to one another now? You're narrating your lives to each other?
I
don't have anybody else to do it with?
They are narrating their lives to each other, but they are also, they are narrating their lives to each other. We also want just random kind of
interactions
like that. So that when I go for a walk, I want the person who's walking up opposite me to say, beautiful day.
Mm-hmm. Got it.
Normalize it.
Right.
I'm just realizing that these things are not helping me. You can hear me now, right?
Yes.
I had these things in and I wasn't using them. One of the things that we are seeing, particularly around COVID, is that the rules here are completely unclear. We don't actually know what we're supposed to do. I'm in Maryland, and when I go back to Connecticut, I'm supposed to be in quarantine for 2 weeks. It took me so much time to figure out what quarantine actually meant. Does it mean I'm supposed to stay in my house? I'm staying in my house anyway. That's not a big deal. Does it mean I can't go to the grocery store? Okay, well, I can Instacart. What it actually, I then learned, means is that my husband, that when I go home, I'm actually not supposed to sleep in the same room with my husband, share a bathroom with my husband. There's all sorts of levels of what something means that are new to me, that aren't really well defined. Now, it's not that we always follow the rules. It's not that we are adherents to the rules. Look, I think that if you were all being completely honest with me, you would say you rarely drive the speed limit, but you have a parameter for how fast you go over the speed limit. So I know, for example, if the speed limit is 65, I'm going to drive 72. That's my speed limit. And the parameters there are clear. The rules are clear. Even though I'm not following the capital R rules, I'm following the small r rules. And I think that it's really hard for us to try and navigate our space when we don't really have clear rules, and both capital R rules and small r rules. The other things that are really important given the circumstances that we're in right now is, first of all, the awareness that some of our kids have about their fears about our mortality or the mortality of their parents. It is foolish for us to say, don't be scared about that. Bottom line is that anytime I tell you not to feel something, what I'm actually doing is, it's kind of like telling somebody who's upset to calm down. That horse is out of the barn. People aren't going to successfully calm themselves down or not be afraid just because you tell me not to be afraid. If you say to me, don't be afraid to go on a roller coaster because we know they're safe, I'm still afraid to go on the roller coaster. I don't like roller coasters. What you've told me is that I shouldn't tell you that I'm afraid. Not that I shouldn't be afraid, because I'm already afraid, but that I shouldn't tell you that I'm afraid, which is effectively making yourself less of a resource. When a kid says to you, I'm afraid you're going to die, I think the answer is not all that difficult. I actually think that the answer is, let me tell you what I'm doing to keep myself safe. Mm-hmm. It does not say I'm not going to die. I am going to die. Someday I'm going to die. But what I want to be able to do is to say to you, I wear my seatbelt. I look both ways when I cross the street. I mean, it should be developmentally appropriate. So with a 16-year-old, I would say, I don't use drugs. I don't smoke cigarettes. I'm doing everything I get my flu shot. I mean, I would give them information that says, this is what I do to keep myself safe. I would not lie. but I surely would not answer the question by saying there's nothing to be afraid of, because that's nonsense, and they know it. Particularly in a community where there has been loss, I think it's really important for people, for parents and grandparents and clergy to acknowledge that that we should all be afraid of loss.
Can we also talk, Betsy, about negotiating the landscape of relationships just for the last couple of minutes that we have? Because
we're negotiating all sorts of relationships right now. We are negotiating and renegotiating relationships. Actually, one of the things that is really important for us to remember about relationships writ large is that they are always in flux. Any relationship worth having is a relationship that is in flux. My relationship with the guy who fixes my car is not a relationship in flux. It's not a negotiated relationship, but my relationship with anybody I care about is a relationship that's in movement, and that changes when circumstances change. So that I should assume that my relationships with my children, with my partner, with my grandchildren, with people I work with, are all relationships that are in flux, and that I have to then be willing to be adaptable and flexible. One of the things we know about stress is that it decreases our ability to be adaptable and flexible. If you recognize that it's at least possible that your own children are under greater stress than you are, that gives you the responsibility to be more flexible than they are. You want me to say that again? Because I think
it's again. That is so important to say again, please.
If this sandwich generation, the generation between children and grandparents, the parental generation, if they are under greater stress than you are, then your job is to be more flexible, more adaptable, more supportive, and not to expect them to feed you, but to expect you to feed them. Now, some of that, and I use the word feeding both because we're Jewish, but also because one of the things I want to suggest to you is something that Beth Kaufman sent to me privately, and then I think is really important. We have historically had a very large gathering for Rosh Hashanah lunch for the first day. Very large gathering. And I make a Rosh Hashanah challah that is big and has apples all the way through it. And my intention this year is to make those for the people who normally come to us, not big ones, to make small ones for all the people who would normally come to us, because I need to feed people, and people need to be fed. And so I will do that for my children, my grandchildren, my close friends, because in fact, sharing a meal is, Risa, I'll send you the recipe. Sharing a meal, is sharing nurturing. And I think that all of us who have any space in our lives to support somebody else should do so. One of the things, and this is probably gonna be my last thought, one of the things we know about anxiety is that focusing on my anxiety does not make it better, but caring for somebody else does make it better. And so if you, as you are anxious and stressed, the most effective thing you can do is to give to somebody else, not to wait to receive, but to give to somebody else. Because as you give to somebody else, your stress will diminish, as will theirs. And the way you do this is you make a regular challah recipe, you roll it out like in a long rectangle, I cut up apples and put cinnamon and sugar on them. I put them all the way over the rectangle. I roll it up like a jelly roll. I roll it into a crown, and it's delicious. So final questions, final thoughts. My wonderful middle daughter is about to give me a glass of wine.
So My only final thought is that as I said to Betsy that I often think of Bamidbar when I think of this whole moment that we are in, the 40-year wilderness journey after the Exodus, and that it definitely was not easy. And to me, the fundamental lesson is that there is no way around but through. I always think about this, that this is multi-generational. Families go through the wilderness together. They emerge differently at the end, prepared to face the future, but each generation contributes something unique in the process, and there are no shortcuts, though we may desperately want them. I mean, it's just we're often tempted to take them and want them, and at this time when COVID has forced us to slow down and to definitely change the way that the normative way in which we do our lives, and to think so carefully about our path forward, I think about that lesson constantly and regularly. Yes. Take the wine and think about the fact that we are in this together, but we are each doing it differently. And the path forward is not a prescriptive one. But it is going to require, and we are each going to have a different experience, but it is going to be an experience that each of us can make unique contributions to in order to get to the destination that we need to get to, hopefully safely, and hopefully in wholeness at the end, with a story that will be a valuable story, that will be a continuing story of family, of peoplehood, and one that has meaning and purpose for ourselves and for our children, and for ourselves as a people that has always held stories as inherently valuable. So we do have one last question, and that Gabby's going to put that up, which is what is the most important takeaway from this conversation? Do we still have time for that, Gabby? If to the extent that people are willing.
The reason we'd like you to do this is that, in fact, as you write this down, what is your most important takeaway from the conversation, you will burn it more deeply into your brain what you learned. And that's always a really useful thing to do. It also will help us know what you heard and what was useful to you. You go back into the Menti, use that same code that's across the top. Thank you. You are not crazy. This is the hardest thing that many of us have ever done. Did I fail?
In certain ways, yes, in other ways, no. I'm just checking.
I'd say everyone picked up the Menti really fast here. They're all coming in quick.
So I believe that you all are going to have the opportunity to go into discussion rooms if you'd like to. Just stick around, and Gabby and David and Lee will put you in discussion groups. Gabby, when this is all finished up, would you print it out and send it to me? Because I would like to have
100%. Thank you all for sharing too. And just as a reminder, this is anonymous. Nobody knows what you are saying, but it's really great to see everyone's responses coming in, and I think validates the way that a lot of people have been feeling. Seeing the chat go people posing questions, sharing ideas, responding to each other in the chat is just wonderful to see too. So yeah, we will put everybody in breakout rooms. If they're optional, if you wish to stay, if you wish to have a conversation, that is what that is for.